Good evening, or if you're watching this on a rebroadcast, hello. My name is Bill Morse, and this is another edition of What Do You Think? This program is designed to hopefully get you to think about some longer, more meaningful issues or trends that we are facing here, not only in Brattleboro, that was a slip, not only here in Bellows Falls, Brattleboro on my mind, but Vermont and the nation as well, and to a longer or larger extent, the world. Many of the issues that we've faced, obviously, over the last 2 years have been faced by much of the world with varying responses. So, we started last time, the week before, discussing and reading George Orwell's novel fiction, 1984. He wrote it in the late 40s. It was published in 1949. And I mentioned that 1949 people had started watching television, or were going over to a neighbor's or a family member's house to watch television. I think it wasn't until maybe 1951, 52 that televisions were in most households. And television was just a visual extension of radio. Radio had become very popular in the early 30s. Some of the stars that lasted into the 70s, like George Burns or Jack Benny, Jimmy Durante, Milton Berle, these entertainers or comedians, some singers, started in the 30s in radio and gradually transitioned in the late 40s and early 50s into television. If you want to go back before radio, entertainment started on the stage. Each town had a theater and a stage, and people went there to see vaudeville acts in the teens and the 20s, comedy, musical reviews, dancing, etc., kind of like a talent show for a high school. And that went to radio in the late 20s, 30s, and then after World War II, during which we made incredible progress as far as technology with radar and explosives and medicine to deal with wounds and transferable to general health issues. We had television. And so we went up to the next level as far as a voice and a message, a visual message coming into our living rooms. And then one television families became 2 and 3 and 4 television families as younger people, children, started having their own TVs in the 60s, as well as personal phones. So I think Orwell saw the level of connectivity going up higher and higher. And as the level of being connected with other people, people you knew and people you don't know, obviously today, as that level of connectivity rose, the interpersonal level seemed to sink. And there was an alienation or a separateness, physical separateness that seemed to set in. And I saw recently, just on this note before we continue reading, an African immigrant who had started living, he had a job in technology. He had moved to Canada. I don't know exactly where, but it was in a suburban location. And I believe he was from Ghana. And he came from a culture where it was warm and where people sat outside and they talked. And there were children playing in the streets. Now, we still have some of that today in some of our cities. I lived for 5 years on a block in South Taylor Street in Philadelphia, and there were anywhere from 4 to 25 children playing on the block, and you could hear them screeching. Here in Bellows Falls, I live on another block where there are not so many children, but you still hear them screeching, very young, high-pitched voices. And maybe 7 or 8 core group. And they were always out as long as the weather was nice. Well, this African immigrant from Ghana was walking with his camera through a neighborhood where he was living in Canada. And this was in March. The weather was still cold. The snow had melted away. But he spent 10 minutes walking through this area where he lived, house after house, and there was not a single child outside. There was not a single person outside. Unfortunately, many people are now living confined in their homes, and if they need to buy something, they can buy it on Amazon online. And if they need to order food, they can also do that online and have the food delivered. My fuel, my propane, is delivered by James on a monthly basis. I don't need to go out and get fuel for keeping the house warm, as an example. But my point is, many of us can, and especially if we have an office job and we work via our laptop, many of us can live at home and not have to go out. Many of us do live at home, often alone, and do not go out for days at a time. It's always sad when we hear about someone who's passed away and their remains or their body weren't found until there was a stench coming from the house or from under a door if they lived in an apartment. We have many people who live alone and have grown accustomed to this. And the last 2 years of lockdowns and social isolation have just kind of pushed this to the next level of alienation. So this is pretty much the setting of the main character in Orwell's 1984. Now, 1984 has come and gone. But I think if you look at what's happening in this story and what is happening now, there are a certain number of parallels that you can see by comparison. And I'm just reading this because I think Orwell was not so much a prophet, but he saw where technology was going to lead us unless it was channeled by more higher level thinking and not for the exploitation of our fellow man, which I believe is happening. So we have the main character, Winston Smith. Pretty common last name, Winston Smith. All right, so I'll pick up, and we're in the first chapter. For some reason, the telescreen, which was the television set that could not only broadcast but receive, for some reason, the telescreen in the living room was in an unusual position. Instead of being placed, as was normal, in the end wall, where it could command the whole room, it was in the longer wall opposite the window. To one side of it, there was a shallow alcove in which Winston was now sitting, and which, when the flats were built, or the apartments, had probably been intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove and keeping well back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen, so far as sight went. He could be heard, of course. Alexa, turn on the lights. He could be heard, of course, but so long as he stayed in his present position, he could not be seen. It was partly the unusual geography of the room that had suggested to him the thing that he was now about to do. And this is where we left off last week. but it had also been suggested by the book that he had just taken out of the drawer. It was a peculiarly beautiful book. Its smooth, creamy paper, a little yellowed by age, was of a kind that had not been manufactured in at least 40 years. He could guess, however, that the look was much older than that. He had seen it lying in the window of a little junk shop in a slum quarter of the town, and had been stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess this book. Party members were supposed not to go into ordinary shops, but the rule was not strictly kept, because there were various things such as shoelaces and razor blades, which it was impossible to get a hold of in any other way. Now, why shoelaces and why razor blades? Why would it be difficult to obtain those items in this society? He had given a quick glance up and down the street and then had slipped inside and bought the book for $2.50. At the time, he was not conscious of wanting it for any particular reason. He had carried it guiltily home in his briefcase, even with nothing written in it. It was a compromising possession. The thing that he was about to do was to open a diary. This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal since there no longer were any laws. But if detected, it was reasonably certain that it would be punished by death, or at least by 25 years in a forced labor camp. Winston fitted a nib into the pen holder and sucked it to get the grease off. The pen was an archaic instrument, seldom used even for signatures. And he had when was the last time you needed to use your signature for something? And he had procured it furtively and with some difficulty, simply because of a feeling that the beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on with a real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand. Does this sound familiar? Apart from very short notes, it was usual to dictate everything into a speak-write, which was, of course, impossible for his present purpose. He dipped the pen into the ink and then faltered for just a second. He dipped the pen into the ink, and a tremor had gone through his bowels. To mark the paper was the decisive act. In small, clumsy letters he wrote, April 4th, 1984. He sat back. A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that this was 1984. It must be around that date, since he was fairly sure that his age was 39, and he believed that he had been born in 1944 or 45. But it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. For whom, it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary? For the future? For the unborn? His mind hovered for a moment around the doubtful date on the page, and then fetched up with a bump against the newspeak word doublethink. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could you communicate with the future? It was of its nature impossible. Either the future would resemble the present, in which case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament would be meaningless. For some time he sat gazing stupidly at the paper. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music. It was curious that he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but even to have forgotten what it was that he had originally intended to do. For weeks past, he had been making ready for this moment, and it had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was to transfer to paper the restless monologue that had been running inside his head literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his varicose ulcer had been itching unbearably. He dared not to scratch it, because if he did so, it always became inflamed. The seconds were ticking by. He was conscious of nothing except the blankness of the page in front of him, the itching of the skin above his ankle, the blaring of the music from the television, and a slight booziness caused by the Victory gin. Suddenly he began writing in sheer panic, only imperfectly aware of what he was settling down to do. His small but childish handwriting straggled up and down the page, shedding first its capital letters and finally even its full stops. It's kind of like the writing that Jack Kerouac did on a roll of toilet paper when he was writing on the road. No full stops, no capital letters. It was just a recording of his thoughts as they came rolling or spooling out of his brain. Very similar. April 4th, 1984. Last night to the flicks. All war films. One very good one of a ship full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean. Audience was much amused by shots of a great huge fat man trying to swim away with a helicopter after him. First you saw him wallowing along in the water like a porpoise. Then you saw him through the helicopter's gun sights. Then he was full of holes, and the sea around him turned pink, and he sank as suddenly as though the holes had let in the water. Audience shouting with laughter when he sank. Then you saw a lifeboat full of children, with a helicopter hovering above it. There was a middle-aged woman, might have been a Jewish, it's a female Jew. Remember, where this is being written just after the Holocaust. Might have been a Jewess. It's a word we don't even use anymore. Sitting up in the bow with a little boy about 3 years old in her arms. Little boy screaming with fright and hiding his head between her breasts as if he were trying to burrow right into her, and the woman putting her arms around him and comforting him, although she was blue with fright herself. All the time covering him up as much as possible, as if she thought her arms could keep the bullets off of him. Then the helicopter planted a 20-kilo bomb. In among them, there was a terrific flash, and the boat went up like matchwood. Then there was a wonderful shot of a child's arm going up, 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 right up in the air. A helicopter with a camera in its nose must have followed it up, and there was a lot of applause from the party seats. But a woman down in the front part of the house, the first row, suddenly started kicking up a fuss and shouting that they shouldn't show this in front of children, that it ain't right to show this in front of kids. But it wasn't until the police showed up and turned her out. I don't suppose anything happened to her. Nobody cares what the proles say typically pro reaction, they never, and I'm not sure what a prole is. Anyway, Winston stopped writing, partly because he was suffering from a hand cramp. He did not know what had made him pour out this stream of rubbish. But the curious thing was that while he was doing so, a totally different memory had clarified itself in his mind, to the point where he almost felt equal to writing it down. It was, he now realized, because of this other incident that he had suddenly decided to come home and begin the diary today. It had happened that morning at the ministry, if anything so nebulous could be said to happen. It was nearly 1100 hours, and in the records department where Winston worked, they were dragging the chairs out of the cubicles and grouping them in the center of the hall, opposite the big telescreen, in preparation for the 2 minutes hate. And we'll leave off right now at that point in the story. When we come back next week, we'll learn more about the 2 minutes hate and why it was obligatory for all employees in that office to watch the 2 minutes hate. So, we will be seeing each other again in another week, always Thursday at 5:45 p.m. for roughly about 20 minutes, because I think reading longer, this is kind of heavy, and smaller bites are easier to digest. So I hope that you have a good weekend coming up, and that you've enjoyed the reading. We will continue, and I hope this is thought-provoking, and that you're able to draw some parallels between what was written as a work of fiction in 1949 and what we are on the path of experiencing here in 2022, not only in our country, but in other countries around the world as well. We are not alone. So, Bill Moore saying thank you for joining with me, and take care, and I look forward to the next reading. Cheers.